Ever wondered what really goes into shaping those massive legislative changes in Washington? Beyond the quick snippets you hear on the news. Today, we're diving deep into one of the most significant and definitely hotly debated pieces of legislation right now. The One Big Beautiful Bill Act.
Yeah, it's a bill that just squeaked through the House. And it's certainly trying to live up to that name, big and beautiful, in terms of just how sweeping its ambition is. Our mission here in this deep dive is really to cut through all the noise. We want to show you what this bill actually is, why it's kicked up such a fervent debate,
right,
and what its implications, which are pretty far-reaching, could mean for you, our listener, and the whole American political landscape.
And you've given us an incredible stack of sources for this. I mean, everything from official committee statements, detailed economic analyses from groups like the CBO and the Tax Foundation, right down to the pretty lively social media discussions, including that rather explosive public fight between some very high-profile figures we'll get into.
Exactly. It's quite a mix.
Yeah.
So we'll be navigating all this intricate stuff to give you the clearest, most distilled understanding we possibly can.
Okay, let's start with the vision. The big and beautiful vision, straight from the folks pushing it, who are largely House Republicans. They're framing this, it seems, as delivering directly on President Trump's America First agenda.
Yeah, what jumps out immediately from their side is just the sheer scale they're talking about. You've got the House Budget Committee Chairman Jody Arrington, for instance. He praised this bill, calling it the greatest single investment in border security and national defense.
Wow.
The largest tax cuts for families and small businesses, and the most significant commitment to unlocking America's energy resources. He even claimed it's the largest reduction in spending in the history of the United States by twofold, which is, well, that's a really bold statement.
A very bold claim. And Speaker Mike Johnson seemed to echo that, right? Calling its passage a major legislative win, hitting their Memorial Day deadline for core goals. So, okay, let's drill down a bit. How are they arguing this bill gives direct economic relief to working Americans and businesses?
Well, at its core, the economic argument from the proponents really centers on making those 2017 Trump tax cuts permanent. You remember those? Significant cuts to individual and corporate income taxes from the last administration.
Right, yeah.
Proponents claim doing this protects the average taxpayer from what they're calling a 22% tax hike. And they say it'll save the average American family about $1,700 a year. They equate that pretty powerfully to 9 weeks of groceries.
That 9 weeks of groceries, that definitely paints a picture. Did the sources get into more detail on how they reached that $1,700 figure? Or, does it apply the same way across different incomes?
The sources mostly present it as an average, for a typical family. The focus is really on the broad impact of stopping those tax provisions from just expiring. Beyond that specific number, though, supporters of the bill are projecting a pretty significant boost to real annual take-home pay. For a median income household, say with 2 kids, they're talking roughly $4,000 to $5,000 more.
Okay.
And for individual workers, they think annual real wages could go up by $2,100 to $3,300. So it's not just about the direct savings. It's about stimulating wages, disposable income, that kind of thing.
And it looks like they've woven in some other specific campaign promises, too. Things like no tax on tips, overtime pay, and even that car loan interest deduction. Though, yeah, only for U.S.-made cars. I also saw something about the child tax credit getting a boost.
That's right, yeah. The bill locks in and boosts the double child tax credit up to $2,500. And that's for more than 40 million families who have Social Security numbers. And then for businesses, there's the 2090A small business deduction, that allows many small businesses like sole props, partnerships, to deduct a chunk of their business income. That gets expanded and made permanent at 23%.
23%. And the projection there is?
They project that specific change could create over 1 million new Main Street small business jobs and generate something like $750 billion in economic growth.
So it's not just personal and small business cuts. It's extending broader business incentives, too, like expensing and R&D deductions.
Exactly. It renews that 100% immediate expensing, which is, a really powerful incentive. Lets businesses deduct the full cost of certain big investments in the year they make them instead of spreading it out over years. Plus, renewed incentives for research and development and interest deductions, too. The big picture economic forecast from proponents is boosting short-run real GDP by, 3.3 to 3.8%.
Yeah.
Long-run real GDP by 2.6 to 3.2%. The goal, they state, is securing 6 million jobs for American workers.
Okay, so Beyond the growth projections, they're also aiming at what they call waste and challenging these woke elite groups. How does the bill actually do that?
Right. This is where that sort of populist appeal really kicks in. The bill aims to end $500 billion in Biden-era tax breaks and special interest giveaways, as they put it, to the wealthy, big corporations, and China. And it specifically goes after woke elite universities by increasing endowment taxes and even making large endowments subject to the corporate tax rate.
Wow. Okay.
They also eliminate tax breaks for billionaire sports team owners. The whole idea, as they present it, is to, realign economic incentives and hold certain institutions accountable.
And then there's the border and national security piece. That's another cornerstone for them, right? What are the key things there?
Oh, a very significant commitment, yeah. The bill sets aside almost $50 billion to restart construction on President Trump's border wall. But it's more than just a wall. There's $4 billion for hiring 3,000 new Border Patrol agents, 5,000 new customs officers, plus another $2.1 billion just for signing and retention bonuses.
Trying to keep people in those jobs.
Right. And funds for 10,000 more IFE officers and investigators, too. Then on the sort of broader national security side, the bill commits roughly $150 billion in defense spending, mostly for shipbuilding and what they're calling Golden Dome missile defense systems.
Golden Dome, like advanced missile shields.
Yeah, basically advanced systems designed to defend against missile threats.
Okay, so from the proponents' angle, all this spending in some areas while cutting elsewhere, it's all part of getting overall spending under control. But it's probably worth pointing out here, the bill also proposes a pretty substantial $4 trillion increase to the debt limit, basically to pay for programs already approved. That feels like a point of tension, which I guess brings us to the other side of the story.
Absolutely. While proponents are painting this picture of, fiscal responsibility, economic revival, the real test of any bill is how it looks when you examine it from different angles. And when we flip over to the not-so-beautiful side, the perspective changes pretty dramatically, especially when you look at the national debt and social welfare programs.
Exactly. The views on the fiscal impact are just starkly different. You've got the Congressional Budget Office, the CBO, estimating this bill would add about $3.3 trillion to the national debt over 10 years, while a Tax Foundation analysis puts it closer to $2.6 trillion by 2034. Either way, that seems to directly contradict that stated Republican goal of curbing spending.
And these numbers are landing at a time when the U.S. federal deficit is already, pretty high, around 6.4% of GDP as of 2024. And the federal debt itself is hovering near 120% of GDP. Some projections even suggest it could climb towards 200%. And look, these aren't just abstract numbers floating out there, right? This kind of debt level has real consequences. We saw Moody's strip the U.S. government debt of its AAA rating back on May 17th.
Right, that was big news.
Yeah, and that can lead to higher bond yields, means higher interest rates for the government to borrow money, which ultimately costs taxpayers more down the line.
So beyond just the debt numbers, opponents are making a really serious charge here, calling this bill anti-Robin Hood, suggesting it basically transfers wealth from the poor to the rich. What does that CBO analysis actually say about that specific claim?
Well, the CBO analysis does suggest a pretty significant redistribution, yeah. It indicates that for the lowest decile of income distribution, that's the poorest 10% of households, their household resources would actually decrease by about 2% of income in 2027 and 4% in 2033.
Decrease.
Primarily, the CBO says, due to expected losses in what they call in-kind transfers, so things like Medicaid and SNAP benefits. But in stark contrast, resources for the highest decile, the wealthiest 10%, would actually increase, mostly because of those proposed tax cuts we talked about earlier.
Wow, okay. That sounds like a really profound shift in who gets what. And speaking of Medicaid and SNAP, there are some major concerns about cuts to social programs, healthcare access. Can you break down what the critics are flagging there?
Yeah, indeed. Critics are really worried about nearly $1 trillion in cuts to Medicaid. They warn this could lead to higher premiums, higher copays, deductibles for millions, and potentially even cause some hospitals and nursing homes to close, especially in rural areas maybe.
And the specific changes driving that?
There's several. New work requirements for able-bodied adults. That means 80 hours a month of work or training, volunteering, school. Also increased copays, more frequent eligibility checks, like every 6 months.
6 months? That sounds like a lot of paperwork.
It does. Plus stricter verification rules and removing undocumented migrants from being eligible at all.
And haven't we seen attempts at these kinds of work requirements before in some states? How did those usually play out?
We have, yeah. And often with pretty significant problems. Past attempts in states like Arkansas, for example, they resulted in enrollment just plummeting. And those rules were later overturned by the courts. So the fear is, we might see a repeat of that.
Okay. And beyond Medicaid, SNAP is also facing cuts.
Yes, significant cuts to the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, that's food stamps, estimated at roughly $230 billion over 10 years. This would happen mainly by adding work requirements for some age groups that don't currently have them, specifically people aged 55 to 64, and even children in some cases, and also by shifting more costs onto the states, requiring them to pay at least 5% of the benefit costs by 2028.
Shifting costs to states, that could indirectly affect other things too, couldn't it? Like school lunches.
Potentially, yes. School lunch programs often rely on SNAP eligibility data, so changes there could have knock-on effects.
So when you put it all together, the healthcare picture, what are the projections for how many people might lose insurance under this bill?
Well, opponents project a pretty substantial increase in the uninsured. They suggest the bill could lead to 13.7 million Americans becoming uninsured by 2034. That's mostly attributed to two things: the proposed end of those Enhanced Affordable Care Act premium tax credits and the administrative hurdles, like we talked about, from those new Medicaid work requirements.
Okay. And what about the impact specifically on immigrant communities? I remember seeing some particularly controversial provisions in our sources there.
Yes, definitely. The bill includes rules that would restrict access to public benefits for families if they have undocumented members. And it imposes what some are calling an unprecedented $1,000 fee on asylum seekers. What's also getting a lot of attention is a proposed 5% tax on international money transfers, remittances made by non-U.S. citizens. That includes people on H-1B visas, green card holders.
A 5% tax on money sent home.
Exactly. This could really hit remittances hard. For example, India gets about $30 billion from the U.S. each year. A 5% tax means $1.5 billion would potentially go to the U.S. government instead of supporting families back in India.
That's a very tangible shift of funds. And finally, higher education, that's also in the crosshairs with this legislation, right?
Critics certainly argue it could have a detrimental impact on America's universities. Things like the elimination of Grad PLAY LS loans, that's a federal loan program for grad students, and capping parent PLAY LEOS loans at $65,000 per student.
Capping those loans.
Yeah, the concern is that these changes could disproportionately hurt Black and Latino families who often rely more heavily on these particular federal loan programs. Also, they're consolidating student loan repayment plans down to just two options. Opponents fear this could actually make the student debt crisis worse and maybe push more students towards private loans, which are often more expensive.
Which brings us to the politics of it all. The fascinating political undercurrents around this bill's journey. I mean, that razor-thin margin it passed by in the House, 215 to 214, that says a lot, doesn't it? Underscores some deep divisions, even within the GOP itself.
Oh, absolutely. That incredibly narrow vote, it really throws a spotlight on the internal tensions inside the Republican Party. Even though this was supposed to be a signature piece of legislation for them, some conservatives actually, maybe surprisingly, balked at the bill's price tag and some other parts of it.
Really? Like who?
Well, we saw some prominent Republican figures vote against it. Senators like Tom Tillis, Susan Collins, Rand Paul. And even in the House committee, Representative Chip Roy voted present, which, effectively signals opposition while still letting the bill move forward to the main floor vote.
Interesting tactic. And then just adding another layer of political drama, you had that public spat erupt between Donald Trump and Elon Musk. Musk came out really strong against this bill, didn't he? Calling it a disgusting abomination.
He did.
And warning Trump's tariffs would cause a recession in the second half of this year. That felt kind of unexpected given their past interactions.
Yeah, that public criticism definitely set off a pretty direct and a pretty fiery back and forth.
Yeah.
Trump publicly said Musk was wearing thin, and later, even more strongly, called him a man who has lost his mind. Musk, for his part, hit back with a really explosive, though unproven, accusation on social media. He posted that @RealDonaldTrump is in the Epstein files. That is the real reason they have not been made public.
Wow. Yeah, that accusation certainly grabbed headlines everywhere. And then wasn't there something about Tesla stock taking a hit after those exchanges? Musk seemed to backpedal a bit afterward.
That's right. After Tesla stock reportedly tumbled following some of this, Musk did later express some regret for his more incendiary posts. Led to a noticeable softening of his tone, at least publicly.
Interesting. And just to be clear on Trump's past association with Jeffrey Epstein, what do our sources actually say?
Yeah, the sources we looked at simply note they were acquaintances back in the 1980s and 90s. appeared together publicly sometimes. There's also that 2002 quote where Trump described Epstein as a terrific guy who enjoyed the company of beautiful women on the younger side, but Musk's specific claim about the files remained unverified. It certainly added a very dramatic twist to the whole political commentary around the bill, though.
Okay, so pulling all these threads together, this deep dive into the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, it really shows just how complex and multifaceted this legislation is. It's viewed in such starkly different ways, isn't it? By the people pushing it and the people opposing it. It kind of encapsulates so many of the big political and economic debates happening in the U.S. right now.
It absolutely does. It vividly highlights these core disagreements we have over economic priorities, social welfare, fiscal responsibility, the things that really define our current political landscape. And it's really crucial to remember, while it did narrowly pass the House, this thing is far from being in its final form. We should expect significant changes in the Senate, different policy priorities there, different rules like reconciliation. They'll undoubtedly shape whatever the final version looks like.
Indeed. So as these policy goals crash into fiscal realities and as political alliances seem to shift and even fracture, what does this deep dive into this One Big Beautiful Bill ultimately tell us? About the fundamental trade-offs we're facing, and maybe the future direction of American governance and how it could impact your everyday life. Definitely something to keep thinking about. We encourage you to keep exploring these really crucial questions.